So we begin our first discussion of art in cultural context in the midst of an era of great change and a time of achievement, exploration, and rediscovery. Covering the period of roughly between 1400 and 1600, the Renaissance brought vast changes to the world of art. The way art looked, the subjects it treated, the way it was thought about, the position of the artist in society, the identities and influences of art patrons, the cultures that served as points of reference, all of these things changed. We might even say that the Renaissance was the time when the concept of art, in air quotes, art began to take shape. During the Renaissance, art's most significant transformation was the shifting from the medieval focus on the divine to a newfound emphasis on the human experience. Above all, they held that humankind was not worthless in the face of God, as had been taught during the Middle Ages. Humankind was God's most perfect creation. Reason and creativity were God's gifts and proof of humankind's inherent dignity. People's obligation to God was not to tremble and submit, but rather to soar, realizing their full intellectual and creative potential. The implications of these ideas for art were tremendous. Artists became newly interested in observing the natural world, and they worked to reproduce it as accurately as possible. They studied the effects of light and the perception of space. They studied the proportions of the human body, as well as anatomy, even going so far as to dissect cadavers. Perspective and chiaroscuro, the close study of nature, the study of anatomy, theories of beauty and proportion, these established painting, sculpture, and architecture as intellectual activities that were allied with science, rhetoric, music, and mathematics. The nude reappeared in art, for the body was held to be God's noblest creation. Who is so barbarous as not to understand that the foot of a man is nobler than his shoe, said Michelangelo, and his skin nobler than that of the sheep with which he is clothed? Artists who considered themselves anonymous workers in the Middle Ages began to be seen as individuals of creative genius or learned persons whose creative powers were considered almost miraculous. The greatest artists were considered in a class by themselves that transcended any social class that might have been determined by their birth. They were respected not because of who they were, but because of what they could do. They lived in courts of nobles and popes. They moved freely in good society. Their company was sought after, and their services were in demand. It has been argued that Leonardo da Vinci was the embodiment of a typical Renaissance man, and his work surely reflects this assumption. The Vitruvian Man, which we're looking at here on screen, combines principles of humanism, geometry, anatomy, and art. Above and below the figure is Leonardo's eccentric reverse handwriting, which was seen very frequently in his sketchbooks and notebooks. The circle and the square were long thought of as symbols of the divine and the earthly, respectively. The arrangement of the figures within the two shapes reflects the Renaissance humanist belief that the human body is a microcosm of the universe. By studying the proportions of the ideal human body, Leonardo and his contemporaries, like intellectuals of antiquity, imagined that they could infer the rules guiding the universe. Italy was the principal homeland of the Renaissance. In time, the movement did spread northward, but it didn't flourish everywhere in Europe, and it came late to places like Spain and Portugal. The art of the Renaissance evolved in different ways in Northern and Southern Europe because the people of the two regions had different backgrounds, different attitudes, and different experiences. We're also looking at an example of Albrecht Dürer's 4 books on human proportions. Dürer is an artist of the Northern Renaissance. Dürer's encounters with Leonardo marks the turning point in his career as a theorist of human proportion. Even though he was influenced by Leonardo, you can see that Dürer's portrayal of humans of all different kinds of shapes and sizes, believing in the importance and the uniqueness of the individual, that approach to the study of human proportions was entirely unique to him at this time. We will look at the evolution of key characteristics of artworks from the early Renaissance through the high and late Renaissance in Italy. Other parts of Europe did respond to changes in culture at this time, and we will look at the different characteristics of Renaissance art in Northern Europe as well. The period of European history extending from about 500 to 1400, 1500 BCE is traditionally known as the Middle Ages. That term was first used in the 15th century, though, by scholars to designate the period between their own time and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. 15th century humanists saw the Middle Ages as being in the middle of two distinct periods of artistic peaks of achievement. The classical world was one period, and their own time was the other. They named their period the Renaissance, literally meaning rebirth, an apt description for the period of renewed interest in art, ideas of classical Greece and Rome. The intellectuals of this time were the first in European history to give their own era an identifying name. In the Renaissance, painting and sculpture were liberated from their medieval roles as book illustrations or as mere supplements to architecture. Based on the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, whose works were newly available at this time, beauty became equated with moral goodness. Renaissance artists sought idealized beauty, one they created by taking the most beautiful features from numerous examples and combining them. Be on the watch to take the best parts of many individual faces, says Leonardo da Vinci. The German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer said something very similar. If you desire to compose a fine figure, you must take the head from some, the chest, arms, hands, feet, and legs from others. For from many beautiful things, something good may be gathered, even as honey is gathered from many different flowers. A treatise on architecture by the Roman writer Vitruvius was read avidly in an attempt to understand classical thought and practice, including ideas about beauty and proportions. Roman ruins still standing were studied in detail, described, analyzed, measured, and drawn. Excavations revealed more examples of statues from the classical era, and these served as an inspiration and ideal for Renaissance artists. The Belvedere torso on the left side of your screen is a 5.5-foot tall fragment of a larger marble statue of a male nude, known to be in Rome from the 1430s. Once believed to be a 1st century BC original sculpture, the statue that we're looking at is now thought to be a copy from the 1st century BC or AD of an older statue, probably to be dated from the early 2nd century BC. The contorted pose and musculature of this torso were highly influential on Renaissance, Mannerist, and Baroque artists, including Michelangelo and Raphael, and it served as the catalyst for the classical revival. So we can see how that twisting and that musculature and that dramatic action of the body shows up in one of Michelangelo's famous nudes from the Sistine Chapel. Between 1530 and 1536, the Belvedere torso was acquired by the Pope. Legend has it that Pope Julius requested that Michelangelo complete the statue fragment with arms, legs, and a face. Michelangelo respectfully declined, stating it was too beautiful to be altered, and instead used it as inspiration for several of the figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, including the civils and the prophets along the borders, as well as the risen Christ and St. Bartholomew in the Last Judgment. The ancient Greeks had been concerned with idealized physical form. Roman artists had emphasized physical accuracy, and artists of the Middle Ages had focused on spiritual concerns rather than physical existence. In the Renaissance, as attention shifted from heaven to earth, artists portrayed Christian subjects in human terms. We see the beginnings of this new humanistic art in the work of Italian painter Giotto. Giotto is considered not only a precursor of the Renaissance, but also an inventor of naturalistic painting, which had not been seen in Europe since the decline of Rome 1,000 years earlier. In Lamentation, on the screen now, Giotto depicted physical as well as spiritual reality as the first Christians grieve over Christ's dead body. In the painting, the body of the crucified Christ has been lowered from the cross and laid on the ground, surrounded by his grieving mother and disciples. His head is held by Mary and his feet by Mary Magdalene. John the Apostle throws his arms wide in despair. To the right, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea wait to prepare the body to be laid in a tomb. The scene is composed as though it were on a stage, and we the viewers were participating in the drama. The space within the picture seems to be consistent with the space of the viewer. We're accustomed today to this window effect in painting, a window onto an illusionary space. But it was revolutionary during the Middle Ages, which was dominated by mostly flat and decorative space in painting. So the figures in Lamentation look as though they were round and full-bodied, and you can see this most evidently in the suggestion of form that the drapery shows us. Clustered low in the composition and surrounding the figure of Christ, these figures enhance the effect of a real event taking place. Giotto's grouping seems very natural, but look at the slope of the hill in the background that directs our attention to Christ in the arms of Mary, the focal point of this painting. Yet another innovation, and perhaps Giotto's most important one, was his interest in depicting the psychological and emotional reactions of his subjects. The characters in Lamentation react in a natural human way that gives this and other of his religious works a unique familiarity for this era. Giotto's painting foreshadows a shift in style and ideas that we will see is the hallmark of Renaissance art. His religious paintings exemplify artwork that holds religion at its center, but becomes increasingly interested in representing the world as it is. Giotto's work takes painting in a new direction, a more naturalistic, more human, more engaging representation of the physical world. This paved the way for a flowering of all the arts that would come in the next century. Almost 100 years after Giotto, Masaccio became the first major painter of the early Italian Renaissance. Masaccio was inspired by classical architecture, and he painted the Holy Trinity to appear as if it were within an architectural setting. This is the first painting based on systematic use of linear perspective as a scheme to create the illusion of figures composed in three-dimensional space. This is using the new techniques of linear perspective to construct a real and convincing space as a setting. The composition is centered on an open chapel in which the holy figures of the Trinity occupy a space under an arch leading to a coffered barrel vault. Within the niche stands Mary, the mother of Jesus. She's gesturing to Christ, and opposite her is Saint John. Kneeling outside of that central image are the donors who paid for the painting, a husband and wife who headed a powerful banking family of that time. He's wearing a red robe, and that marks him as a member of the Florence City Council. The figures of the Holy Trinity each have a physical and emotional presence that shows that Masaccio learned from what he saw in the work of Giotto. The artist has arranged the figures in a stable triangle that extends from the head of God the Father, who stands over the dead Christ, through the two donors to either side of the holy grouping, and then outside of their sacred space. This triangular, or sometimes pyramidal, organization would remain a favorite device of Italian Renaissance artists. Masaccio's composition is organized by a vanishing point located directly underneath the cross, and we can see this in the diagram to the left of the painting here, at the midpoint of the ledge on which the donors kneel. So this is really significant. The single vanishing point at the base is below the base of the cross, about 5 feet above the ground, 5 feet above the actual floor of the church in which it was located, is about the height of the average viewer. So for visitors to the church, this painting is designed to be as convincing an illusion as possible so that the sacred scene is really present before them. Masaccio's perspective was so precise that we can see the interior of the illusionary chapel as a believable extension of the space that we occupy. A favorite part of this fresco is God's feet. Actually, you can only see one of his feet, though. God is standing in the painting. So here, Masaccio imagines God as a man. In medieval art, God was often represented by a hand, as though God was an abstract force or power in our lives. But here, he seems very much like a flesh and blood man. This is a good indication of humanism in the Italian Renaissance. Why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? Scholars have offered many reasons. Italians had long lived among the ruins of Rome, and they viewed themselves as direct descendants of the earlier civilization who could bring back its glories. Humanism originated in Italy, and the first university position in Greek studies was created there. The church was centered in Italy, and it was still an important patron of the arts. Before the Renaissance, only two classes of people could afford to be art patrons, and those were the nobility or the clergy. Italy was one of the first areas to recover economically from the chaos of the Middle Ages. Powerful city-states engaged in extensive trade, and banking had also developed. So in the 15th century, a new class of merchant rulers who were wealthy, socially ambitious, and fiercely competitive in commissioning the finest artists came into being. The wealth of Italian merchants enabled them to compete with one another and with the church officials and nobility for the recognition and power that came with art patronage. During the Renaissance, artists received growing support from a new class of wealthy merchants and bankers, such as the Medici family, who, with great political skill and a certain ruthlessness, dominated life in Florence and in Tuscany. The Medici Palace, which we're looking at here, is in the heart of Florence, and this was the home of Cosimo de' Medici, a wealthy banker who sought to link his family to the city. Besides serving as the private residence of the House of Medici, the palace hosted many outstanding political figures, and one such example was Galeazzo Maria Sforza, the Duke of Milan. The patron de' Medici used his home to embody new ideas about art and his family's important role in the Florentine Republic. Although much of the building was inspired by ancient Greek and Roman architecture, the architect Michelangelo di Bartolomeo used heavy, roughly carved stone in the lower level, and we can see that in a detail in the upper right portion of your slide here. The stone base visually linked the new building to the city's medieval palaces, including the town hall, known today as the Palazzo Vecchio. Below is a picture of a stone bench incorporated into the exterior of the building, a place for people to sit while waiting for their turn to go in and speak with Cosimo de' Medici. Notice the windows with a triumphal arch shape, another characteristic common in the Renaissance architecture that was inspired by Roman military arches that were so widespread in antiquity. The elaborate cornice that tops the palace, the round arches, the inner courtyard surrounded by columns were all based on the floor plan of ancient Roman homes. During the Italian Renaissance, the nude became a major subject of art as it had been in Greece and Rome. The few nudes that appeared in medieval art showed little sensual appeal and were often used to portray shame and lust. But under the influence of humanist scholars who sought to surpass the Greeks and Romans in the nobility of form, the nude became a symbol of human worth and divine perfection, a physical representation of the immortal soul. Among early Renaissance artists, the finest sculptor was by far Donatello. Donatello's David was originally commissioned for the courtyard of the Medici Palace and would have been visible to the Medici's customers and peers. Donatello's David is the first life-size, freestanding male nude statue since ancient Roman times. As such, it reflects the humanist interest in Greek and Roman art by celebrating the nude human form as God's most perfect creation. Donatello brought the Greek ideal of what it means to be human into the Christian context. He chose to portray the biblical shepherd David, slayer of the giant Goliath, and later king of the Jews, as an adolescent youth rather than a robust young man. The young David stands in contrapposto and his body is naturally proportioned. Contrapposto is the term given to a pose with almost all of the weight of the body placed on one foot, on the foot of the standing leg, and every shift in the figure's weight and pose is expressive. Although he was greatly attracted to the classical ideal in art, Donatello's sculpture was less idealized and more naturalistic than that of ancient Greece, and we can see this difference when we compare his David to the statue by Polykleitos, Doryphorus. David is a biblical figure who would have inspired the people of Florence. The theme of the underdog defeating the more powerful giant Goliath was highly symbolic to Florentines who were surrounded by stronger enemy cities. This theme would soon be taken up again by Michelangelo. Another Medici commission is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which is the first large mythological painting since classical antiquity. To place a nude, non-Christian goddess at the center of a large painting in a position previously reserved for Mary or Christ was novel. Botticelli and his Medici patrons believed that an artwork need not have a Christian subject to be uplifting and beautiful. Completed in about 1480, this work depicts the Roman goddess of love and beauty just after she was born from the sea. The composition shows Venus arriving on land on the island of Cyprus, born of the sea spray and blown there by the winds, Zephyr and perhaps Aura. The goddess is standing on a giant scallop shell, and she seems as pure and perfect as a pearl. As she arrives, Venus is greeted by a young woman who represents spring. In her posture of introspection and repose, Botticelli's Venus combines the classical Greek idealized human figure with a Renaissance concern for thought and feeling. The figures appear to be in relief. They are not entirely three-dimensional. The background is decorative and flat, giving almost no illusion of deep space. And so this is unique to Botticelli at this time. Works like The Birth of Venus would have hung in the homes of wealthy nobles, merchants, and bankers, and represented their power and social status within the community. Although Botticelli's lyrical and unusual linear style, as well as his pale modeling, were an exception to Renaissance norms, they were highly appreciated by the Medici circle. Between 1490 and 1520, the short but also glorious period known as the High Renaissance, Italian art reached a peak of accomplishment in the cities of Florence, Rome, and Venice. During this time, some of the most celebrated works of Western art by many artists were produced, and among them, the work of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Few paintings have captured the hearts and minds of art lovers as much as Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, the 15th century mural depicting the last meal Jesus shared with his disciples before his crucifixion. Its handling of space, its mastery of perspective, the treatment of motion, and a complex display of human emotion has made it one of Western art's most recognizable paintings and among Leonardo's most celebrated works. During this last meal, Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." And this provokes a series of reactions among all the disciples that are captured beautifully in this masterpiece. All 12 of the disciples have different reactions to the news with varying degrees of anger and shock. In the bottom right corner of your screen, you see a page from one of Leonardo's sketchbooks where he is making studies of the expressions and the features of the 12 apostles. The traitor Judas, seated fourth from the left with his elbow on the table, leans away from Jesus and clutches a bag containing 30 pieces of silver, his price for handing Jesus over to the authorities. In his Renaissance quest for knowledge, Leonardo researched the biblical texts in order to understand each disciple's personality, their physical features, and their mannerisms in order to depict the individuality of each man. Leonardo's Last Supper transforms the biblical event into a psychological portrait of Christ and his disciples. This is one of the most powerful examples of how humanistic philosophy can be seen in religious works. The space in this painting opens up before us like a theater stage. In Leonardo's use of linear perspective, he conveys a logical space that the figures can realistically occupy. All of the architecture of the banquet hall relates to parallel lines that seem to converge at the painting's center. These include the lines at the ceiling and the implied lines running atop the cloths hanging on either wall. Leonardo used perspective to communicate space, but also to communicate the meaning of the painting. If we trace all the receding lines to where they merge, we would find they merge at Jesus' head in the front of the distant vanishing point on the horizon. Perspective forcefully directs our eye to the more important part of the composition, the face of Jesus. The Last Supper continues to intrigue us to theorize around how hidden geometry strengthens the symbolism of the painting. So I'm not going to draw any conclusions here at all, but here are a few mathematical or symbolic alignments that you might consider. 3 windows at the back and their symbolism, the Holy Trinity. 3 times the number of windows given to the sides of the room, 12, the number of disciples. The architectural pediment over Christ's head, suggesting a halo. Christ's figure as a stable triangle, a triangle of peace and equanimity, contrasting with the turmoil of the disciples. So This work was commissioned as part of a plan of renovations for a church and a monastery in Milan by Leonardo's patron, Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. Leonardo worked on the Last Supper from about 1495 to 1498, but he didn't work on it continuously. And so in order to permit his inconsistent painting schedule and his frequent revisions, it is painted with materials that allowed for regular alterations. Things like tempera, gesso, pitch, which is a type of tar, and mastic, which is a type of varnish. Some of these are water soluble, not all of them agree with each other in chemical ways. And so due to the methods that are used and a variety of environmental factors, as well as some intentional damage, little of this original painting remains today, despite numerous attempts to restore it. And the last restoration was completed in 1999. Some commentators consider it a pivotal painting in inaugurating the transition into the High Renaissance. So we've already talked about the significance of the Mona Lisa in a previous module and the impact that it had on artists and poets in the Renaissance and well beyond. We can still be intrigued by the mysterious mood evoked by the faint smile and the strange, otherworldly landscape. The ambiguity is heightened by the hazy light quality that gives a sense of atmosphere around the figure. This soft blurring of the edges, in Leonardo's words, without lines or borders in the manner of smoke, achieved through subtle value gradations, is a special type of chiaroscuro invented by Leonardo, and the name for that is sfumato, the Italian word for smoke. Most important, though, for the history of art, this work, the Mona Lisa, is a portrait of an individual, a type of art fairly common in ancient Rome, but almost unknown through the medieval period. Humanism influenced the belief that the individual was a worthy subject for a portrait. Leonardo's rival in greatness was Michelangelo, who began his career in Florence, but also worked in Rome. Michelangelo established his reputation as a sculptor at the age of 25. A year later, he received a commission for the colossal image of the biblical hero David, the subject taken up a half a century earlier by Donatello. Michelangelo was regarded by his contemporaries as difficult. He was held in most contempt as a moody virtuoso. He never took students, he never took apprentices, but he was named the chief architect, sculptor, and painter by the Pope. He created many of the most important works for the papacy, including sections of the Sistine Chapel. The David took him 3 years to finish, and this is a monumental sculpture that is now located in the Accademia in Florence. The pose of Michelangelo's David is unlike that of earlier representations of David. The bronze statue by Donatello and other artists represented the hero standing victorious over the head of Goliath, but no earlier Florentine artist had omitted the giant altogether. So rather than being shown victorious over a foe much larger than he, Michelangelo's David looks wary as he sizes up the giant Goliath before the battle has actually taken place. His brow is drawn, his neck is tense, and the veins bulge out of his lowered right hand. His left hand holds a sling that is draped over his shoulder and down to his right hand, which holds the handle of the sling. The twist of this body is contrapposto, effectively conveying to the viewer a sense of potential energy, the feeling that he's about to move. So it's not just grace and beauty standing still, but it's the potential for what comes next. The statue is a Renaissance interpretation of a common ancient Greek theme of the standing heroic male nude. The proportions of this David are atypical of Michelangelo's work as well as of Greek models. The figure has an unusually large head and hands, and this is particularly evident if you look at the right hand hanging down at his side. These enlargements may have been done due to the fact that the statue was originally intended to be placed on the cathedral roofline, where the important parts of the sculpture may have been accentuated in order to be visible from below. By incorporating these changes in proportion and through artful depiction of inner feeling, Michelangelo both humanized and made monumental the classical Greek hero. Not long after completing the David, Michelangelo began what has become his best-known work, the Vatican Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes. He had been called to Rome by Pope Julius II in order to design his tomb, a large monument with numerous sculptures. Julius abandoned that project and decided to take advantage of Michelangelo's skills as a painter. Michelangelo, whose distaste for painting was well documented, resisted the plan, but in the end he was forced to capitulate and painted the ceiling of the Pope's private chapel over the course of 4 years. The ceiling is painted in a true fresco manner or process. The true fresco is the most durable method of painting murals, since the pigments are completely fused with damp plaster and become an integral part of the wall surface once the plaster is dried. Michelangelo was initially commissioned to paint part of the ceiling with images of the 12 apostles that can be seen in the triangular support in this image where the ceiling and the wall meet. But ultimately, Pope Julius was persuaded to give him a free hand, and Michelangelo proposed a more complex scheme, representing the creation, the fall of man, the promise of salvation through the prophets, and the genealogy of Christ. The most famously admired composition on the ceiling is the majestic Genesis scene, the creation of Adam. In this scene, God reaches out to give life to the first man. Eve, not yet mortal, stares at Adam from behind God's left arm. God is depicted as an elderly, white-bearded man wrapped in a swirling cloak, while Adam on the lower left is completely naked. God's right arm is stretched out to impart the spark of life from his own finger into that of Adam, whose left arm is extended in a pose mirroring God's, a reminder that God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness of God." Unlike other scenes, this image is not an illusion of a specific story of the Bible. Michelangelo invented the image to tell the story of the relationship between God and humanity from a Renaissance point of view. A very humanist point of view, where God is an idealized, rational man with an interest in humans. Raphael was the third major artist of the High Renaissance. His warmth and gentleness were in sharp contrast to Leonardo's solitary intellectual nature and Michelangelo's formidable moodiness. Of these three major creators, Raphael's work most frequently embodied the clarity and balance that marked the art of the period. His paintings present his awareness of the divine in human beings, the insight that was the driving enthusiasm of the Italian Renaissance. In the School of Athens, we see one of the clearest summation of Renaissance beliefs. The School of Athens elevates human reason by presenting a philosophical discussion among learned people as an ideal. The Pope commissioned this work for the wall of a meeting room so that those discussing church business could be inspired by an ideal meeting of great people from the past. Rarely has humanism been so clearly expressed. For Pope Leo X, a Medici descendant, Raphael made a series of cartoons for tapestries that would decorate the walls of the Sistine Chapel below Michelangelo's ceiling. The tapestries have faded, but the cartoons remain most of their original vivid colors, as we can see in this example, Paul preaching at Athens. Leo X wished to glorify the early church by commissioning illustrations of important events in the Acts of Apostles, and Raphael responded by creating memorable and dramatic works. The message of this work, that reason can transmit religious truth, perfectly expresses Renaissance beliefs. Raphael included the figure of the Pope Leo in the composition, just to the left of Paul. The concentration of artistic energy in Rome during the Renaissance was such that while Michelangelo was working on the Sistine ceiling, his slightly younger rival Raphael was only a few steps away, painting the fresco of the school in Athens in the private library of the same Pope, Julius II. While religion and politics drove great artists to seek their fortune in Rome, commerce turned the Republic of Venice into the third great center of Italy after Rome and Florence. Located on the water at the north end of the Adriatic Sea, Venice was a cultural crossroads, a major trade center. Spices and luxury goods flowed through the ports of Venice on their way from South Asia to Western Europe. Venice was famous for the glass that it produced there since antiquity. This glass was coveted throughout the Western world, and it solidified Venice's reputation as a city of luxury and beauty. Giorgione's Adoration of the Shepherds gives us a glimpse into the style of Venetian Renaissance art. The colors are saturated and almost glowing as Giorgione and other Venetian artists took advantage of oil painting's capability for glazes or thin, transparent washes of color that, when layered on top of each other, build a great deal of luminosity. The fabrics worn by the shepherds seem luxurious, and perhaps this refers to the textiles that were passing through the city of Venice. Giorgione's image reveals a special sensitivity to the way light functions. The lights and the shadows falling on Joseph's head and body are based on a careful study of nature. It has been said that their watery home made Venetian painters especially sensitive to light. Northern artists didn't have the same connection to antiquity as the Italians, not living among the ruins of Rome, and they didn't share the same sense of a personal connection to the creators of the classical past. Instead, Northern Renaissance art evolved gradually out of the Middle Ages as artists became increasingly entranced with the myriad details of the natural world and better at capturing them. While the Italian masters were being commissioned for religious buildings and were obsessed with structure, accurate perspective, and the underlying musculature of the body, Northern artists had a different preoccupation that arose naturally out of their heritage. The North had a long tradition of painted miniatures, manuscript illustrations, stained glass, and tapestries, all decorative arts with a great deal of surface detail. So Northern artists perfected their skill at capturing the textures of satin or velvet, the angles of drapery and folds, the sheen of silver and gold, and the quality of skin down to its last pore and wrinkle. Northern Renaissance artists are interested in depicting the realism of secular figures, ordinary objects, and the natural world. Jan van Eyck was a leading painter in Flanders, the region of present-day Belgium, and adjacent parts of France and the Netherlands. He was one of the first artists to use oil painting as a medium. His oil paintings today remain in almost perfect condition, and this is an indication of his skill and his knowledge of those materials. The fine consistency and the flexibility of the new oil medium made possible a brilliance and a transparency of color that were previously unattainable. Later Italian artists would admire and would imitate the innovations of Van Eyck and other Flemish artists. The Arnolfini portrait is considered one of the most complex paintings and original paintings in Western art. This is because of its beauty, its complex iconography, its use of perspective, and in the expansion of the picture space with the use of the mirror. The portrait likely commemorates a wedding or betrothal, although because the identity of the people is in question, we may never know. The medium of oil paint permitted Van Eyck to capture surface appearances and distinguish textures precisely, and he painted in minute detail, achieving an illusion of depth, of directional light, mass, rich implied textures, and the physical likenesses of these particular people. He also rendered the effects of both direct and diffuse light by showing the light from the window on the left reflected by various surfaces, and we can see some of this in the detail in the upper left portion of your screen right now. It has been suggested that he used a magnifying glass in order to paint the minute details, such as the individual highlights on each of the amber beads shown hanging beside the mirror. Many of the ordinary objects portrayed with great care have sacred significance, indicating the artist's skillful use of iconography. Here are just a few. The single lighted candle in the chandelier symbolizes the presence of Christ. The amber beads and the sunlight shining through them are symbols of purity. The dog indicates marital fidelity. Green, a symbol of fertility, was often worn at weddings. The bride holding her skirt in front of her stomach may indicate her willingness to bear children. As a witness to the event, Jan van Eyck placed his signature and the date, 1434, directly above the mirror. And so we can see this in the detail in the bottom left corner of your screen. And that inscription reads, Jan van E has been here. 1434, the date of the painting, and then he himself appears reflected in the mirror. So this adds a narrative to the painting. It poses more questions than it can answer, and it also provides us with a very unique aspect to this work, which is that there is a painting within the painting, a portrait within a portrait, or a self-portrait within a portrait, as it were. The mirror has the effect of compressing space. In other words, because the mirror is there, we feel the nearness of the presence of the wall. But at the same time, it also expands the space and it brings the outside world into the picture plane and then into the heart of the composition. The illusionism of this painting was remarkable for its time, in particular for the rendering of detail, but particularly for the use of light to evoke space in an interior, for its utterly convincing depiction of a room as well as the people who inhabit it. Painting was as new and revolutionary as Donatello's or Masaccio's work was in Italy. Human figures and their interior settings took on a new believable presence. A simple corner of the real world suddenly being fixed onto a panel as if by magic. For the first time in history, the artist became the perfect eyewitness in the truest sense of the term. The concept of painting as a window into a world similar to ours was originated with work such as this. Albrecht Dürer was a German painter, printmaker, and theorist of the German Renaissance. Born in Nuremberg, Dürer established his reputation and influence across Europe in his 20s due to his high-quality woodcut prints. His trips to Italy enabled him to bring back knowledge of Italian techniques of perspective and figure drawing, which he wrote about in several widely studied treatises. We saw an example of his figure proportions earlier in the module. Also among the humanist ideas that Dürer took from his travels to Italy was the increasing belief in the artist as a uniquely creative individual rather than a wage worker. He embodied this belief in several self-portraits, most especially in the one that we see depicted here to the left of your screen. He posed himself face to face with the viewer using a position and an otherworldly gaze generally reserved for Christ. He appears thoughtful, confident, and perhaps even spiritual as he emerges from the darkness. Dürer's Night, Death, and the Devil is one of 3 large prints from 1513 to 14. These prints are closely interrelated and they complement each other as a coherent body of work. They correspond to the 3 kinds of virtue in medieval scholasticism: theological, intellectual, and moral virtue. Called simply the Reuter by Dürer, Night, Death, and the Devil embodies the night as a representation of the state of moral virtue. The cautionary tale here is to remain vigilant in order that you may not be deterred from the path of virtue because it seems rough and dreary, or because you've been fighting many various evils for too long. So remain vigilant in spite of all of that. Riding steadfastly through a Nordic gorge, Dürer's knight rides past Death on a pale horse, who holds out an hourglass as a reminder of life's briefness, and is followed closely behind by a pig-snouted devil. As the embodiment of moral virtue, the rider is undistracted and true to his mission. As a young man, the artist Peter Bruegel traveled extensively in France and Italy. The special focus of his paintings is on the lives and surroundings of common people with rich landscapes, rather than on myth, religious imagery, or portraits of nobility. Such works that depict scenes from everyday life are still beloved today, and they are called genre paintings. Calendars painted by medieval manuscript artists had depicted each month according to the agricultural labor appropriate to it. Toward the end of his life, Bruegel did a series of paintings represented the activities of the 12 months of the year. In this one, Hunters in the Snow, Bruegel shows peasants augmenting their winter diet by hunting. New here is the emphasis on nature's winter mood as a backdrop for human activity. There's no evidence of a successful hunt, and there's a long way to go before getting home. The heavy steps of the hunters are extended in the row of trees and the frozen ponds in the distance. So it's not just depicting the hunters walking through the snow, it's the way the other elements of the composition create a sense of the continuity of their pace, their motion. Everyone in this painting looks like they are working hard just to make it through the snow. Even the body language of the dogs, with their heads hanging low, looks tired, or at the very least, disappointed. The receding trees, the descending birds, the changes in scale and depth all lend a sense of gravity, heaviness, and time to the composition. The illusion of deep space, which is so important to this image, came from the innovations of the Italians, the atmospheric perspective, and was also inspired by Bruegel's journey over the Alps. The details of the crags and the distant mountains would have also been informed by those travels. So we come to the end of episode 3 with one optional question for reflection. In what ways does the Arnolfini portrait demonstrate how Northern European Renaissance art is different from Italian Renaissance art? You got this. And I'll see you next time for episode 4.